This is a sprawling epic of pride, ancestral secrets, and the terrifying price of arrogance. Here is the Queen in Rags. The Caravan of Pride. Ezen did not walk. She floated on a cloud of her own self-importance. As the gates of the Odiari family compound swung open, the dust kicked up by her carriage seemed to settle only on those she deemed inferior. She was the daughter of a wealthy palm oil merchant, and today she was arriving at her new husband's home. But Ezen had not come alone. Behind her carriage marched 10 women, draped in dull gray cloth, their heads bowed so low their chins touched their collarbones. These were her maids, her status symbols. Mother-in-law, Ezen called out before she even stepped off the carriage. Her voice was like a sharp needle, piercing the quiet dignity of the compound. Lady Obiamaka, a woman of silver hair and eyes that saw through stone, stepped out of the main house. She didn't look at the silk Ezen wore. She didn't look at the gold dripping from Ezen's ears. Her gaze went straight to the 10 maids. "You bring a small army into a house of peace, Ezen," Obiamaka said, her voice a low hum. "My son, Namdi, married a wife, not a governor." "A woman of my standing cannot scrub floors, mother," Ezen mocked, stepping down and smoothing her robes. "I have brought 10. One to cook, one to clean, one to fan me, and one to simply stand and look beautiful, so I am never bored." She pointed to the smallest maid at the very back of the line, a girl named MMA. MMA's wrap was torn, and her hands were calloused, but her eyes held a terrifying stillness. "That one," Ezen sneered, "is the most useless. She doesn't speak. She doesn't cry. I bought her from a traveling caravan for the price of a broken clay pot. She will be the one to wash your feet, mother-in-law. Consider her a gift." Obiamaka looked at MMA. For a split second, the wind in the compound stopped blowing. The goats stopped bleating. A heavy, ancient coldness swept through the air. Obiamaka's eyes widened in a flicker of recognition, or perhaps fear, but she quickly masked it. "Be careful who you call useless, Ezen," the older woman whispered. "In this land, the dirt you walk on today is the king of tomorrow." Ezen laughed, a hollow, dark sound. "Tomorrow is for the poor. Today belongs to me." She marched into the house, leaving the 10 maids standing in the sun, oblivious to the fact that the girl she had bought for a broken pot was carrying a crown invisible to the mortal eye. The salt and the scar. The first week in the Odiari house was a reign of terror. Ezen spent her mornings lounging on imported cushions, barked orders at her maids until their hands bled. She was particularly cruel to MMA. "The soup is too salty," Ezen screamed, flinging a wooden bowl at MMA's head. The hot liquid splashed across the girl's shoulder, but MMA didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She simply knelt and began to wipe the floor with her own tunic. "Are you a stone?" Ezen hissed, leaning down until her breath hissed against MMA's ear. "I want to hear you scream. I want to see you beg. Why won't you look at me?" MMA continued to scrub. "The sun does not scream at the clouds, mistress," she said softly. It was the first time she had spoken. Her voice sounded like the grinding of ancient tectonic plates, deep, resonant, and impossibly old. Ezen recoiled as if bitten by a viper. "How dare you speak in riddles? You are a slave. You are nothing." She grabbed a decorative brass rod from the table and struck MMA across the back. The blow was heavy, enough to break a normal woman's spirit, but when the rod hit MMA's skin, it made a sound like metal hitting iron. In the doorway, Lady Obiamaka watched, her heart thumping against her ribs. She saw what Ezen was too blinded by rage to see. Where the brass rod had struck MMA's back, the gray cloth had torn. Underneath, there was no bruise. There was a mark, a birthmark in the shape of a coiled leopard, glowing with a faint, ghostly luminescence. "Ezen, stop," Obiamaka commanded, her voice trembling. "She is my property, mother." Ezen shrieked, her face contorted with a dark, ugly pride. "If I want to break her, I will." "You cannot break what was never made of clay," Obiamaka whispered, but Ezen was already storming away to find Namdi, ready to weave a web of lies about how the slaves were uprising. MMA stood up slowly. She looked at Obiamaka. The girl's eyes, usually dark, suddenly flashed with a brilliant, predatory gold. "The house is leaning, Elder," MMA said. "Tell your son to check the foundations. When the queen stands up, the roof will fall." The night of the crimson moon. That night, the moon rose over Omuoka tinted with a sickly, bruised red. It was the moon of reaping. Namdi, Ezin's husband, was a kind man, but he was weak. He loved Ezin's beauty and feared her temper. When she told him the maids were stealing her jewelry, he didn't ask for proof. He simply ordered them to be locked in the outer shed without food or water. "Even MMA?" Namdi asked, glancing at the girl who was currently fanning Ezin with a steady, rhythmic grace. "Especially her," Ezin spat. "She looked at me with gold in her eyes today. She is a witch. Lock her away before she curses our bed." As the guards dragged the 10 maids toward the shed, the air in the village began to grow thick and humid. The forest surrounding the compound started to groan. Inside the shed, the other 9 maids huddled together, weeping. They were terrified, but MMA sat in the center of the dirt floor, her legs crossed, her hands resting on her knees. "Do not weep," MMA said. Her voice didn't come from her mouth. It seemed to vibrate out of the very ground. "The debt is almost paid. She took our silence for weakness. She took our service for shame. She does not know that a queen only serves to learn the hearts of her subjects." "Who are you?" one of the girls whispered, shivering. MMA looked up. The thatched roof of the shed seemed to vanish, revealing the crimson moon. "I am the daughter of the sun and the moon. I am the one who was exiled, so that I might find a heart worth saving. I have found only rot in this room." Suddenly, the locks on the shed door didn't just break, they turned into butterflies and flew away. The walls of the shed began to glow with a soft, ethereal light. Outside, Ezin was laughing in her husband's arms, dreaming of more gold and more slaves. She didn't hear the drums starting in the distance. She didn't hear the leopards gathering at the edge of the compound. She didn't know that the broken pot she had purchased was about to become the hammer that would shatter her world. Ezin reached for the crown, thinking even now of its value. But when her fingers touched the metal, it grew so heavy it pinned her hand to the earth. She was trapped, kneeling in the dirt, as the first rays of the morning sun revealed her shame to the entire village. The widow's threshold. The iron crown did not release Ezin until the sun was high enough to scorch the back of her neck. When the weight finally lifted, her hand was bruised purple, a permanent reminder of her greed. Namdi tried to approach her, his face a mask of conflict, but Lady Obiamaka pulled him back. "She belongs to the debt now, Namdi," his mother whispered. "If you interfere, the queen's shadow will fall on you too." Ezin was led, not by guards, but by a strange, invisible pull in her chest, toward the very edge of the village. There stood a hut so small it seemed to be held together by hope and spiderwebs. This was the home of Monkiru, a woman who had lost her husband, her children, and her sight to the great fever years ago. "Who is there?" the widow croaked, her hand fumbling for a walking stick. "Your new servant," a voice echoed from the trees. It was the queen's voice, though she was nowhere to be seen. Ezin looked at her own hands, wrinkled and trembling. She looked at the piles of laundry by the door, stiff with red mud and age. "I cannot do this," Ezin whimpered. "I am Ezin of the Odiari house." "You are the woman who broke the clay pot," Monkira said, sensing the direction of the voice. "The queen told me you were coming. She said you have a lot of pride to wash away. Start with the water pots. The stream is a mile away." Ezin turned to run, but her feet felt like lead. Every time she moved away from the hut, the phantom pain of the iron crown crushed her heart. With a sob of pure rage, she picked up the heavy clay pot, the very thing she had once used as a measurement for MMA's worth, and began the long, humiliating walk to the water. The shadow at the stream. The path to the stream was narrow and choked with thorns. In her previous life, Ezin would have been carried in a litter, shielded by silk umbrellas. Now, The thorns tore at her thinning hair, and the sun blistered her aging skin. As she reached the water's edge, she saw a reflection that made her scream. The woman looking back was a hag. Her eyes were sunken, and the merchant's daughter, glow was gone, replaced by a gray pallor. "Looking for your beauty, Ezen?" She spun around. Standing under the shade of a massive irako tree was a shadow. It had no face, only the silhouette of a woman wearing a crown. It was the queen's shadow, left behind to watch her. "Give it back," Ezen pleaded, falling to her knees. "I'll give you my father's warehouses. I'll give you the gold buried under the hearth." The shadow moved closer, the air around it dropping to freezing temperatures. "The queen does not want her gold. She wants your why." Why was the salt more important than the girl's hunger? Why was the brass rod more important than the girl's breath? She was just a maid. Ezen shrieked. The shadow tilted its head. Suddenly, the water in the stream turned into a mirror. Ezen saw a vision of her own mother, years ago, treating a servant with the same cruelty. She saw that her pride wasn't hers. It was a disease passed down through blood. "Fill the pot," the shadow commanded. "The widow is thirsty." Ezen dipped the pot into the water. It felt as heavy as a mountain. As she lifted it to her head, she felt a sharp crack in her spine. The shadow didn't help. It simply walked behind her, its silent footsteps echoing the beat of a funeral drum. The salt of repentance. Back at the hut, Monkiru was waiting. "The water tastes of bitter tears, girl. Pour it into the basin and start the fire." For 3 days Ezen slaved. Her silk robes were now rags, stained with soot and grease. Her hands, once soft and smelling of jasmine oil, were cracked and bleeding. On the 4th night, Monkiru asked her to cook the evening meal, a simple soup of bitter leaf and dried fish. Ezen, driven by a flicker of her old malice, reached for the salt. "If I make it inedible, she will let me leave," she thought. She poured a handful of salt into the pot, grinning to herself. But as the soup boiled, the steam didn't smell of salt. It smelled of jasmine. "Taste it," the shadow whispered from the corner of the room. Ezen took a spoonful. Her eyes went wide. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted, but as she swallowed, she felt a burning sensation in her throat. Every grain of salt she had added turned into a memory of a cruel word she had spoken to MMA. She saw the face of the maid she had splashed with hot soup. She felt the girl's silent pain. She felt the loneliness of the shed. I can't," Ezen choked out, dropping the spoon. "Eat it all," Monkira said, her blind eyes fixed on Ezen's soul. "You've fed others your bitterness for years. It is only fair you finally taste it yourself." Ezen sat on the dirt floor, weeping, as she forced herself to eat the soup of her own sins. Outside, the leopards began to howl, and the village of Omuoka trembled. The queen was watching, and the lesson was far from over. The weakness of men. Namdi could not bear the silence of his empty bed. The silk sheets felt like cold skin, and the memory of Ezen's laughter, even her sharp, demanding laughter, haunted the corners of the room. He was a man who preferred a beautiful lie to a hard truth. "She has suffered enough," Namdi whispered to the shadows. He ignored his mother's warnings and crept out of the compound under the veil of a new moon. In his hand, he carried a heavy purse of gold and a sharp iron dagger. He reached the widow's hut just as the owls began to call. Through the cracks in the mud walls, he saw his wife. She was huddled by the hearth, her once regal face covered in ash, her hands raw and weeping. "Ezen," he hissed, rushing through the door. Ezen looked up, a flicker of her old arrogance returning to her eyes. "Namdi, you've come to take me back. Kill the old woman. Burn this place to the ground." "Hush, my love," Namdi said, pulling her to her feet. "I have gold. We will flee to the coast, where the queen's name is unknown." But as they turned to the door, the air grew thick and heavy, like liquid lead. The shadow of the queen rose from the dirt floor, stretching until its head touched the thatch of the roof. "The debt is not paid, Namdi Odiari," the shadow boomed. "Out of my way, spirit," Namdi cried, lunging with his iron dagger. But the blade passed through the shadow as if it were smoke. The shadow reached out and touched Namdi's chest. He didn't bleed, but he fell to his knees, his face turning a ghostly white. "You offer gold to buy a soul?" the shadow mocked. "Gold is just the sun's waste. For trying to steal the queen's prisoner, you shall lose the one thing you valued most, your voice." Namdi opened his mouth to scream, but only the sound of dry leaves rustling came out. He was now as silent as the maids he had allowed his wife to torture. The hunger of the forest. With Namdi silenced and shivering on the floor, the shadow turned its gaze to Ezen. "You see? Even your savior is a broken thing. Your father's wealth cannot reach here. Your husband's love has no tongue. What do you want from me?" Ezen wailed. "The forest is hungry," the shadow replied. "Monkiru needs firewood. The deep forest, Ezen, where the trees have teeth." The drum of the unseen. The drums did not sound like the wooden instruments of the village. They sounded like a heartbeat coming from deep within the earth, steady, thumping, and relentless. Inside the main house, Ezen bolted upright in bed. The crimson moonlight was pouring through her window, staining her silk sheets the color of fresh blood. Namdi was fast asleep beside her, his breath shallow. She shook him, her manicured nails digging into his shoulder. "Namdi, do you hear that? The slaves have escaped." Namdi groaned, rubbing his eyes. "Ezen, it is just the wind in the trees. Sleep." But Ezen knew the sound of the wind, and this was not it. She threw on her robe and ran to the courtyard. What she saw froze the marrow in her bones. The shed door was wide open, hanging on a single hinge. But the maids were not running. They were standing in a circle in the center of the compound. In the middle of the circle stood MMA. She was no longer wearing the gray rags. The tattered cloth had fallen away, revealing a gown made of what looked like woven starlight and leopard fur. Her hair, once matted with dust, was now a crown of thick, gravity-defying coils adorned with emeralds that hummed with light. "What is this mockery?" Ezen shrieked, though her voice wavered. "Where did you steal those clothes?" "Guards." "Seize them." The village guards rushed forward, spears leveled. But as they reached the circle, their legs refused to move. It was as if the air had turned to stone. They stood like statues, their faces twisted in silent terror. MMA turned her head. Her eyes were no longer human. They were two burning suns. "The time for mistress is over, Ezen," she said. "I am MMA Abesai, the rightful heir to the silver throne of the East. I came to your house as a servant to see if the rumors of your cruelty were true. I hoped to find a spark of humanity. I found only a desert. The trial of the 7 tears. A queen." Ezen laughed, though it sounded like a sob. "You are a slave I bought for a broken pot. Namdi, tell her she is nothing." Namdi had finally stumbled out onto the porch, Lady Obiamaka trailing behind him. The older woman immediately fell to her knees, pressing her forehead into the dirt. "Mother, what are you doing?" Namdi gasped, reaching for her. "Quiet, fool," Obiamaka hissed. "Can you not feel the ancestors breathing on your neck? This is the lost queen, the one who was prophesied to walk among the low to judge the high." MMA Abesai stepped toward Ezen. Each footprint she left on the ground bloomed with white lilies that withered and turned to ash within seconds. "7 times you struck me with the brass rod," MMA Abesai said, her voice echoing in everyone's skull. "7 times you mocked my silence. For every blow, a year of your life shall be stolen. For every mockery, a piece of your beauty shall fade. You can't do this," Ezen screamed, reaching for her face. "I am the daughter of a merchant. I am wealthy. Your wealth is made of the sweat of those you crushed," the queen replied. She raised a hand, and the 9 other maids, who had been silent, began to hum a low, haunting melody. Ezen's skin began to itch. She looked down at her hands. The smoothness was vanishing. Fine lines began to spiderweb across her knuckles. Her long, dark hair began to fall out in clumps, hitting the dirt like dead leaves. "Namdi, help me," Ezen wailed, reaching for her husband. But Namdi stepped back, his face filled with a mixture of pity and horror. He saw the woman he had married for her surface, and as that surface vanished, he realized he didn't know the soul beneath it at all. The weight of the crown. The village was no longer silent. Neighbors began to peek over the walls, their eyes wide as they witnessed the fall of the Odiari house's pride. Mma Abesai walked past the crumbling Ezen and stood before Lady Obiamaka. She reached down and gently lifted the old woman's chin. "You saw me, elder," the queen said softly. "Even when I wore rags and carried the slop bucket, you saw the spirit. Why did you not stop her?" Obiamaka wept, her tears wetting the queen's shimmering robes. "I was a coward, my queen. I feared for my son's happiness more than I cared for justice. I thought if I stayed silent, the storm would pass us by." "Silence in the face of cruelty is the same as a blow," Mma Abesai said. "But because you showed mercy to my sisters in the shed, your house shall stand. But it shall be a house of service, not of masters." The queen turned back to Ezen, who was now a huddled heap of gray skin and ragged breath, looking twice her actual age. "You wanted 10 maids, Ezen," the queen said, a cold smile touching her lips. "Now, you shall be the maid. You will serve the poorest widow in this village. You will wash her feet with the same water you threw at me. And you will do it until your heart feels the weight of the copper you once thought was so small." With a sudden flash of light that blinded everyone for a heartbeat, the queen and the 9 maids vanished. Where they had stood, there was only a scorched circle in the earth and a single, heavy crown made of solid iron sitting in the dust. Ezen was pushed out into the night. The forest surrounding Omaoka was no longer a place of wood and leaf. It was a living, breathing creature. The branches reached out like skeletal fingers, snatching at her hair. As she stumbled deeper into the dark, she heard voices. Not the queen's voice, but the voices of the 10 maids. "Is the wood too heavy, mistress? Is the dark too cold, mistress?" She saw them flitting between the trees, 9 spirits of gray and 1 of starlight. They weren't attacking her. They were simply there, a constant reminder of her cruelty. Ezen found a fallen branch, but as she touched it, it turned into a serpent that hissed and bit her hand. She screamed, but the forest swallowed the sound. She realized then that she was in a world where her pain didn't matter. In this forest, she was the useless one. She was the broken pot. She fell to her knees, clutching her bitten hand. "I am sorry," she whispered into the dirt. "I am sorry I didn't see you. I am sorry I didn't hear you." The spirits stopped moving. The forest grew deathly still. The first seed of truth. Ezen didn't return with firewood that night. She returned with a handful of bitter berries and a heart that was starting to crack. She found Monkirus sitting by the cold hearth. Namdi was gone. The shadow had sent him back to his mother's house to live in his silent shame. "You didn't bring wood," Monkirus said, her blind eyes sensing Ezen's presence. "No," Ezen whispered. "The trees wouldn't give it to me. They said I had too much fire in my blood already." Monkirus smiled, a slow, toothless grin. "The trees are wise. Sit. Tell me about the first girl you ever hurt." "Not MMA. The very first one." Ezen sat. She didn't want to speak, but the words felt like they were being pulled out of her by a hook. She told the widow about a small girl named Chi-Chi, her childhood playmate, whom she had accused of stealing a doll just to see the girl get whipped. She told her about the dozens of others whose spirits she had bruised to make herself feel tall. As she spoke, the gray pallor of her skin began to shift. It didn't become beautiful again, but it became human. The wrinkles remained, but the dead look in her eyes began to soften. "I liked the power," Ezen admitted, her voice trembling. I liked that they had to look at the ground when I walked by. It made me feel like I was more than just a merchant's daughter. It made me feel like a god. And what are you now? Monkiru asked. I am a woman with a bitten hand and a stomach full of bitter soup, Ezen said. From the corner of the room, the shadow watched. It noticed that the glowing birthmark on the queen's back, the coiled leopard, had appeared faintly on Ezen's own bruised hand. The debt was being paid, but the queen had more than just punishment in mind. She was looking for a replacement. The sky of iron. The rain did not come. Usually, by this time of year, the heavens would open and soak the earth of Omuoka, turning the dust into life-giving mud. But the sky remained a flat, merciless sheet of iron. The yams withered in the ground like mummified fingers, and the streams retreated into the cracked bellies of the earth. In the village, the panic was a physical heat. People who had once bowed to Ezen now looked at her with narrow, hungry eyes as she walked to the dry well. They blamed her. They said her arrival with the Shadow Maid had cursed the land. The queen is eating our harvest, they whispered. Inside the tiny hut, Monkira grew weak. Her breath sounded like dry husks rubbing together. The water is gone, Ezen, the widow wheezed. And the last of the grain is mostly dust. Ezen looked at her own hands. They were no longer the hands of a lady. They were calloused, burnt, and scarred. She felt a strange, new sensation in her chest, an ache that wasn't for herself. I will find food, mother, Ezen said. It was the first time she had called the widow anything other than old woman. As she stepped outside, the shadow was waiting. It pointed toward the Forbidden Grove, a place where even the bravest hunters refused to go during a drought. There is a spring in the heart of the grove, the shadow hissed. But the spirits there do not take gold. They only take what is vital. The sacrifice of the vessel. Ezen entered the Forbidden Grove. The air here was stagnant and smelled of ancient, undisturbed rot. As she pushed through the brittle vines, she reached a small clearing where a single, stunted tree stood over a pool of water no bigger than a cooking pot. But guarding the pool was a creature that made Azaka look like a dream. It was a mass of shifting thorns and eyes, a forest wraith that fed on the thirst of a living. I need water for the widow, Ezen said, her voice steady. The creature's eyes rippled. Many come for the water. They offer their jewelry. They offer their cattle. I do not want those things. What do you want? Your blood is the only thing wet enough to pay for this spring, the creature growled. 1 cup of water for 1 cup of your life's heat. Ezen looked at the clear, cool water. She thought of Monkiru's parched lips. She thought of how she used to watch her maids faint in the sun and only laugh. She knelt by the pool and held out her arm. Take it, she said. The thorn creature wrapped a vine around her wrist. The thorns sank deep. Ezen didn't scream, though the world began to spin and grow dark. She watched her blood flow into the roots of the tree, and in exchange, the pool bubbled up, filling her clay jar with sweet, cold water. As she stumbled back toward the village, clutching the jar to her chest, she didn't see the queen watching from the canopy. MMA Abase's expression was no longer cold. It was expectant. The breaking of the drought. Ezen reached the hut, her vision blurring, her heartbeat a faint drum. She pressed the jar to Monkira's lips. Drink, she whispered. As the widow drank, the color returned to her face. But something else happened. As the water, bought with Ezen's sacrifice, entered the widow's body, the blind woman's eyes cleared. The milky film vanished. I can see, Monkira gasped, looking at the ragged, bleeding woman before her. Ezen, your face. Ezen crawled to a corner, too weak to respond. But as she lay there, the sky above Omuoka finally broke. A thunderclap shook the foundations of the world, and the rain began to fall, not in drops, but in sheets of silver. The villagers ran into the streets, laughing and dancing in the mud. But the rain was different where it touched the widow's hut. It turned into liquid gold that soaked into the ground, healing the withered crops instantly. The shadow entered the room. It didn't look like a silhouette anymore. It was glowing with a soft, white light. It merged with the rain, and suddenly, the queen herself, Maids, stood in the center of the hut. "The lesson is almost complete," the queen said, looking down at the fading Ezen. "You gave your blood for a woman who was once your slave's host. You chose a blind widow over your own life. Is it over?" Ezen managed to ask. "The punishment is over," the queen replied. "But the destiny is just beginning. Omuoka needs a ruler who knows the weight of the dirt as well as the shine of the crown." Maids reached out and touched Ezen's forehead. The scars from the thorns didn't vanish. They turned into intricate patterns of silver skin that looked like royalty. The merchant's wrath. The news of Ezen's humiliation had traveled on the wings of gossip until it reached the coastal city where her father, Master Okeke, sat upon his throne of palm oil wealth. To Okeke, a daughter was an investment, and his investment had been defiled. "They have turned my blood into a water carrier?" Okeke roared, his fist shattering a glass flagon. "They have made a merchant's daughter a slave to a blind hag?" He did not believe in spirits or queens. He believed in the cold, hard weight of iron and the men who used it. He hired 40 mercenaries, men from the north who wore leather armor and carried long, curved blades that had tasted the blood of kings. They marched toward Omuoka, not as guests, but as a scythe. In the village, the air turned cold despite the recent rains. Ezen, still recovering from her sacrifice at the grove, felt a sharp, familiar dread. It was the scent of her father's expensive tobacco and the metallic tang of his cruelty. "He is coming," she whispered to Monkaru. "Let him come," the widow replied, her newly healed eyes bright with an ancient fire. "The forest has been waiting for a man who thinks his gold is louder than the ancestors." The burning gates. The mercenaries arrived at dawn. They didn't knock. They kicked down the wooden gates of Omuoka and tossed torches onto the thatched roofs. The screams of the villagers rose like smoke into the morning sky. Master Okeke rode at the front on a white horse, his eyes searching the chaos for his daughter. He found her standing in front of the widow's humble hut. He stopped his horse and laughed, but it was a sound of disgust. "Look at you. You smell of soot and mud. You look like the very dirt I used to wipe from my boots." "I am standing on the earth that fed me, father," Ezen said, her voice calm. The silver patterns on her skin began to glow faintly as the sun hit them. "Leave this place. The debt of this house is settled." "Settled?" Okeke spat. "I will settle it with fire. Men, burn the old woman's house. Drag my daughter to the carriage. If she resists, chain her like the slave she has become." As the mercenaries stepped forward, the ground began to ripple. It wasn't an earthquake. It was as if the earth itself were becoming liquid. The 9 maids appeared from the shadows of the burning houses, their eyes glowing like coals. "You bring iron into a house of spirit," the maids spoke in unison, their voices shaking the mercenaries' bones. Okeke sneered, pulling a pistol from his belt. "I bring the world of men to a village of fools. The king of dust." Before Okeke could fire, the queen, Maids, stepped out from the smoke of a burning hut. She wasn't wearing starlight now. She was wearing the armor of a warrior queen, carved from the bone of the great forest elephant. "Master Okeke," she said, and the fire on the roofs instantly went out, leaving only cold ash. "You have spent your life buying and selling souls. You think everything has a price. Tell me, what is the price of your breath?" The mercenaries, hardened killers though they were, dropped their blades. They saw not a woman, but a mountain of ancient judgment. One by one, they fled into the forest, leaving Okeke alone on his horse. "My gold!" Okeke screamed, his mind snapping under the pressure of the queen's presence. "I have enough gold to buy your kingdom. Then eat your gold," Maids commanded. Okeke's horse bucked, throwing him into the mud. As he scrambled to his feet, his silk clothes began to heavy. The gold coins in his belt grew hot, melting and merging into his skin. He didn't turn into a statue. He turned into a walking monument of his own greed. His skin became dull, heavy brass. Every movement was a shriek of metal against metal. "You shall walk the coast for 100 years," the queen decreed. A man made of the metal he loved, unable to touch, unable to eat, and unable to find rest until a single person offers you a cup of water out of true love. Okeke tried to cry out, but his throat was now a pipe of cold brass. He turned and began the long, heavy walk toward the sea, his footsteps leaving deep, metallic craters in the road. Ezen watched her father go. She felt no joy, only a profound, quiet pity. She turned to Ememe and knelt. The village is broken, my queen. The houses are ash. A house can be rebuilt, the queen said, placing a hand on Ezen's shoulder. But a soul, once shattered, needs a leader who has been through the fire. The throne of Omuoka is yours, Ezen. Not because of your father's wealth, but because of the scars you carry. The coronation of ash. The morning after the fire, Omuoka was silent, but it was not the silence of death. It was the silence of a new beginning. The villagers emerged from their hiding places, their eyes settling on the woman standing in the center of the scorched square. Ezen was no longer the pampered merchant's daughter, nor was she the broken hag of the widow's hut. She stood tall, her silver-patterned skin catching the light like dew on a leaf. Beside her stood Lady Obiamaka and the widow Monkiru, the two pillars of her new world. The queen has departed the physical realm, Monkiru announced, her voice carrying across the clearing. But she has left behind a heartbeat. Ezen, who bled for our water and stood against the fire, shall lead us. There was no golden crown. Instead, the 9 maids stepped forward, each carrying a different gift of the earth, a handful of fertile soil, a jar of river water, a branch of Irako wood, and a stone from the deep caves. They wove these elements together into a circlet of living vines that pulsed with a green light. As the crown was placed on Ezen's head, she didn't feel the heavy, crushing weight of the iron crown from before. This crown felt light, like a promise. But as it touched her brow, a flood of memories that weren't hers rushed into her mind. She saw the faces of every maid who had ever been mistreated in the history of the land. She felt their silent cries. I accept this burden, Ezen whispered, her voice amplified by the spirits. I will not be a queen of walls. I will be a queen of the soil. The secret of the 9. With the village rebuilding, a question burned in Ezen's heart. She called the 9 maids to the great tree. They stood before her, their gray robes now shimmering with a soft, iridescent light. You followed me when I was a monster, Ezen said. You served me when I didn't deserve a drop of your sweat. And you stood by Ememe as her shadow guard. Who are you, truly? The eldest of the maids, the one who had been struck most often by Ezen's brass rod, stepped forward. She lowered her hood. Her face was not that of a servant, but of a woman whose beauty surpassed anything Ezen had ever seen in the coast. We are the unclaimed, the maid replied. We are the spirits of girls who died in the service of cruel masters. We are the ones whose names were forgotten, whose graves were unmarked, and whose stories were silenced. Ezen felt a cold shiver of realization. The queen didn't buy you from a caravan. No, the maid smiled sadly. She gathered us from the winds. We were the 10 parts of her own soul that she cast out to test the world. MMA was her heart. We were her patience, her strength, her memory, and her grief. You didn't bring 10 maids to your mother-in-law's house, Ezen. You brought a goddess divided. The maids began to fade into the light of the setting sun. Now that you have learned to see the invisible, we can return to the stars. But remember, every time a girl is silenced in your kingdom, our shadows will return. The Kingdom of Shadows. Years passed, and the story of the Queen in Rags became the foundation of Omuoka. The village grew into a city, but it was a city unlike any other. There were no grand palaces of marble. The houses were built among the trees, and the laws were carved into the stones of the river. Ezen ruled with a wisdom that was often mistaken for magic. She remained scarred, and she never regained the perfect beauty of her youth, but when she walked through the market, the people didn't bow out of fear. They stepped aside out of a deep, abiding respect. Namdi lived out his days in the palace as her silent advisor. Though he never regained his voice, he learned to communicate through the language of the drums and the tilt of his head. He had become a man of observation rather than declaration, and in his silence, he finally found the peace he had lacked when he was a man of many words. On her final day, as an old woman, Ezen walked to the edge of the forbidden grove. She looked into the clear pool where she had once given her blood. A young girl was there, fanning herself with a leaf, looking at her reflection with a pout of dissatisfaction. "Am I beautiful, grandmother?" the girl asked, noticing Ezen. Ezen touched the silver scars on her own arm and smiled. "Beauty is alone, my child. It is a dress you wear for an afternoon. But your shadow is yours forever." She looked up at the sky and saw 10 stars shining more brightly than the others. She closed her eyes, her debt fully paid, and her spirit rose to join the circle. The merchant's daughter was gone. The queen of the soil had found her rest.